My hope, if I'm leaning into hope, is that we can imagine a future for our spiritual traditions and faith traditions that not just honors and recognizes, but invest in the genius of women. It's not just about rewarding those who most actively replicate or mimic what men's leadership looks like, but see the unique genius and understanding that women carry into these spaces.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Pamela Prickett. Amid an unrelenting year, a year in which suffering has really pervaded social life, self-care has become a buzzword. Ads and articles about self-care abound on social media and everyday discourse, but I think all too often our discussions about self-care have been disconnected from thinking about community care. So today we're going to be talking about caring for ourselves, particularly as women, and how self-care links to loving others across differences in race or faith. Our guest is Reverend Jennifer Bailey, a self-described millennial reverend. She serves as an associate minister at the Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville, Tennessee. In addition, she is founder and executive director of the Faith Matters Network. Thank you, Reverend Bailey, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let me start by saying that I'm a sociologist, and so I'm trained to be skeptical about what we sometimes call self-care, right? And I worry that it's sometimes used as a cover up for the root causes of our anxieties, which are so often the result of institutions exploiting our bodies, right? And our labor. Or self-care is used to sell us stuff. That said, I'm also a mother and a partner and a very tired working woman. And so I want more self-care, and I want to be thinking about care in general. And that's kind of what we want to do on today's episode. So I'm curious how you think about all this. How do you see your set of intersecting identities as African American, millennial, a reverend, influencing the way you seek self-care?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. In our work at Faith Matters Network, the organization I lead, we're a womanist-led organization, and we understand care to be the cornerstone of transformational social movements. And when we talk about care, what we're talking about is a form of collective care that recognizes and sees the deep humanity of those who are participating and coexisting and being in relationship and movement together. An example of collective care is seeing that my sister is struggling at this moment to show up fully because of something that's happening in her life, and inviting her into a period of rest, renewal, and reflection, and then stepping in to be able to cover some of the things that she might have on her plate. And so to me, this notion and orientation towards the collective is in practice and praxis deeply relational, and it's also deeply womanist in that it emerges out of our understanding of the genius and wisdom and real practice of Black women throughout the centuries.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that tradition if they're not familiar?
Sure. I understand womanism to be both a social theory and a practice and praxis, meaning that it is an embodied way in which women live. Womanism, initially that term was coined by Alice Walker in a text called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And in it, she talks about womanism being to feminism as purple is to lavender. It's a deeper shade of purple. It's an understanding that is deeply rooted in the intersectional ways in which Black women have historically been maligned and yet have thrived and flourished in part because of our understanding of the world. I have a mentor who says that Black women in the United States have never had a vision of liberation that wasn't inclusive of everyone, because we fundamentally know that if we center the voices of those who are most marginalized in our society and do what's right for them, that the quality of life improves for everyone else. And so that is the lineage of which I see myself a part of.
Thank you for that. I think it's, if we can bring it back to the idea of care, what kind of care do women in the communities that you work with need?
Sure. I'll say that's a multifaceted question for me, both in terms of where I learned about care and how to care, and where I most actively see, in particular, the Black women that I work with most needing care in this moment. In her definition of womanism, Alice Walker talks about a womanist being separatist only for self-care, only for the need of her health, is the way that she frames it. Meaning that the orientation of a womanist is always towards community, but there are some times when community just gets on your nerves, and you've got, for your own safety and sanity, you got to take a break. And so as I think about the women in my own very specific lineage, so I talk a lot and think a lot about the church mothers in my church growing up. I think about these women who weren't clergy in our tradition, although women in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, of which I'm part of, have been able to be ordained for a long time, but who, through their very example, instilled in me a sense of self-worth in a world that didn't love us back as Black folks. Who in the church kitchen, along with sort of slipping me a sweet roll after Sunday school, would also pass on a word of affirmation and love and care, who fed the community out of their gardens and out of their sense of collective responsibility for the whole. I think what they taught me is that you don't need a lot to be able to care for folks. And at the same time, I think the other side of that coin is that when I think about women like my mother, who very much emerged in that tradition and passed away in 2016, my mom was one of those people who very much carried the weight of her family and her community on her back. And so her back was very strong. But because she was carrying so much, she didn't always attend to herself in the way that she should have and could have. And so when I look around today at my loved ones and colleagues and other folks in the spaces in which I inhabit, I see a similar trend often, in particular among Black women who feel like they need to take on everything or carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. And I do think that it is an intervention of younger generations to say, actually pause. No, we refuse to fully and completely succumb to this notion of exhausting ourselves on behalf of others. And so I'm excited and I get really moved when I see folks claiming that space.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up this sort of these generational differences, because that was going to be one of my questions, is how do you see it changing across different cohorts, right, within the church, which you touched on. And so if I may just to kind of to get you to talk a little bit more in terms of the personal. So what does that look like? I mean, how do you take care of yourself?
There's an old saying that you do the ministry you most need. And so I don't actually know that I'm great at taking care of myself, but I am good at surrounding myself with people who love me, who remind me to take care of myself. So I'll share a story that I think tracks along with my own evolution, both in thought around this and in practice around this. So I found out I was pregnant in January of 2020 after a long journey that included pregnancy loss and a pathway of really wanting and yearning for a child. And as we all know, in March, a global pandemic took over our lives. And then George Floyd was killed and Breonna Taylor was killed. And I remember thinking, first with Breonna Taylor's death, which happened before George Floyd's, and then later with George Floyd's death and sort of the notion of this uprising that was happening around the country, this reckoning and recognition of the deep ways in which violence against Black bodies is intrinsic to the very nature of life in the United States. I, in my 20s, I'm now 33, very much would have seen myself as a protester who would have been out there as soon as I was ordained, out there in a collar, may have done that work of putting my body between protesters and police, because there's something about the collar and what it symbolizes that allows them to see me in ways that in my experience, even as a Black woman, it connotes a particular type of authority that I may not see with some of my beloved colleagues and friends in movement. But I had this awakening moment in June after George Floyd was killed, where I was sitting there, 6 months pregnant, watching all of these things unfold on my screens and realizing that the best thing I could do for Black life in that moment was to stay my butt at home, as my grandmother would lovingly tell me. Go sit someplace is what my grandmother would tell me, sit your behind someplace, was to be present in my body and nourishing and taking care and protecting my physical body because, people didn't care if protesters were pregnant. As a Black-bodied person, they don't always see the fullness of your humanity, to say the very least. And so it was a turning point moment for me. And in my recognition of something I always knew, which is that particularly in relationship to movement, recognizing that many of the questions and issues that we are reckoning with in this season are not the product of a single event, but are the results of 400 years plus of history, and that the transformation we're seeking is not the stuff of an election cycle, but of a generation to transform, which in some ways feels unsatisfying, but in other ways feels deeply relieving because it opens up the pathway of understanding ourselves in different roles at different times. And so I say all that to say, I think caring for myself last year very much looked like staying at home and figuring out how I might be of service remotely to some of my beloveds who were on the streets. And so that recognition and acknowledgement that we all have different roles to play at different seasons of our life, I think is one step in thinking about care.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And now you're a mom. So how can we think through this tension that so many women feel, right? To care for others, to care for their children and their partners and their family members and their friends and their, church members, and also try to balance that with self-care. I mean, how do you think about that? Or do you have some ideas when you're talking with people in your community that you think about?
Sure. So interesting. One of my colleagues is celebrating a birthday today at Faith Matters Network, and we got her a shirt that says personal boundaries and joy, which very much sums up her personality and is perfect. And so I laugh, but I also think that's true. I was reminded recently of the choreo poem for colored girls who've considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. And there's a poem in there that just simply says, someone almost walked away with all of my stuff. And I think there's a tendency when we pour out and pour out and pour out, we are giving and giving and giving of ourselves. And if we don't pause for a moment to be refreshed, then we're allowing people to walk away with all of our stuff and leaving nothing for ourselves. And I know that I'm a better mom to Max. I'm a better partner to my husband, Ira. I'm a better friend and organizational leader and just homegirl to the people who matter to me when I am doing the things that I know I need to do to be full and filled. And that looks like rest. That looks like when I can have it, because with a 6-month-old, it's really hard to rest. It looks like taking time to watch really trashy reality TV, because that is one of my spaces of joy. It is taking a walk and caring for my body, even though that's not the most natural inclination for me. And I do that work, again, just to try to help us shift the language, not as a self, but as a self in relationship to others. So it is collective, right? The way that I am able to show up is in community is directly correlated to the way that I am caring for myself. Also, let me be very specific. I'm a Black woman, and I come from working class Black women, and they've always had to juggle a lot and care for a lot. They've always had to work. I mean, both forced labor as the direct descendant of slaves, and the idea that my great grandmother and grandmother would not be working is this kind of foreign to me because they always did. And so I say that to also say that as I think about this question of care and what womanhood means to me, it has always been lived at these intersections. And I've seen the consequences when the women I love in my life have not taken that time out, when the community has not prioritized their health in the context of what's happening in a particular moment. And the consequences, quite literally, is death, right? And a type of sacrificial martyrdom that only serves to perpetuate cycles of harm.
And I love what you're saying about, thinking about care and self-care is really part of a relationship to a larger whole, right? And so how do we build better and healthier communities for women? And I'm thinking specifically about faith communities. So maybe some of the work that you do, how do you see the hope for healthier church and faith communities?
I think we already know, right? So I think that the seedlings of and wisdom is already present in our communities. It's just harvesting them, harvesting the fruit of the knowledge that's been planted, and being honest about what our needs are. I don't know that I consider myself an activist. It's so interesting. Someone was asking me the other day to talk about my vocational trajectory and how I see myself in the world. And my answer is always, I first see myself as a minister of the gospel, inheritor of the Jesus movement, that radical vision of kingdom that in which all belong and are seen as beloved in the eyesight of God. And second, see myself as clergy in the AME Church because I'm accountable to an institution that matters a great deal and that has a deep history, including at our best, the uplifting of women's leadership, which is at our best. Yeah, and then third and finally, as founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network. And in that work, it's interesting. I don't know that I would call myself an activist or even an organizer so much as I'm pastoring my team, even though my team is multi-faith and multidimensional, but it's all women, right? And so I think what I've learned along the way in developing alongside these genius women at F&M, who are the heart and soul of our organization, is to define what our core values are and not just live them externally, but internally. And so for us at F&M, those three core values that root our work are connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. And if we're doing that work in the world through projects like our Daring Compassion Movement Chaplaincy Program, that's training up a new generation of folks in this vocation that is emerging called the Movement Chaplain. If we are working with clergy in North Carolina through our Disciples of Welcome program, encouraging them to care for themselves and their communities, if we are doing the work of mapping and trying to feed the ecosystem of work at the intersection of care and spirituality and social healing and social justice work, then that means I need to give my team off days, right? It means that our internal values have to be reflected. And one of the things that we've been experimenting with over the past year is thinking about different seasons for our work. And that includes seasons of intentional rest. And it's about creating a way and mode of being that, as an organization that's primarily made up of Black women, is reflective of our practice and praxis and what we see as necessary to our thriving, not just survival, but thriving. And so I'm always happy to talk to anybody about all the mistakes we've made along the way. Yeah. And I think all of that applies to the church too. And my hope, if I'm leaning into hope, is that we can imagine a future for our spiritual traditions and faith traditions that not just honors and recognizes, but invest in the genius of women. It's not just about rewarding those who most actively replicate or mimic what men's leadership looks like, but see the unique genius and understanding that women carry into these spaces. And that includes queer women, that includes trans women, that includes gender nonconforming folks, right? includes a very broad swath of those who've been otherized or told that their leadership is not necessary. Because, I mean, those are the places that I see a spiritual life flourishing, is work that emerges out of this very particular core wisdom that is women's wisdom.
One thing that I'm hearing is that it's not just about getting women and a broad, broad definition of women into leadership roles. It's actually changing the leadership, the way we think about leadership, the way we try to lead our communities. Am I hearing you correctly?
Absolutely. I'm a millennial, which used to mean something very particular, but as millennials are knocking on 40's door, I want to remind folks that millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. There's a whole generation of Gen Zers who are roasting us on the internet and who are coming with their own energy, wisdom, and just vitality and genius. But one of the great gifts of being a millennial in this particular moment is that I see myself as a part of a bridge generation. And one thing that is true about me and my ilk is that we came of age at a time when institutions were collapsing around us. And what is different, I think, than the worldview of my beloveds and Gen Z is that we actually were taught and trained to exist and flourish in the institution, and they failed us, and we're like, oh, this is bullshit, right? This is bullshit. And it was a rude awakening for us. I think the people coming behind us are like, oh yeah, those institutions never worked, right? And so I've often talked about millennials as cartographers. So as folks who were born of age in a time when institutions were collapsing and literally new land masses were emerging, which means that new maps were emerging. And it was necessary for somebody to map what was happening. And I see the same thing happening in American religious life right now, that literally there are institutions that are dying. And rather than seeing that collapse as a negative thing, I come from a tradition that very much believes that out of death comes new life. I think we're in a moment that can begin to reimagine what faith communities look like, what spiritual life looks like, what leadership looks like. And I think the pandemic, in all of its horror, has also accelerated some of those processes. I don't think we're going to go back to work the same way as we did prior to the pandemic. And I think that's a good thing, because I think the way that we worked was inhumane. And the same thing I think is true about religious life and spiritual life. I don't think that things are going to ever go back to quite the way that they were. And that will require some hospicing of certain things and ideas and beliefs and tender care in the midst of that. And it opens up this space for me of radical imagination of what might be possible. And that means that we don't have to do leadership the same way we've always done leadership. It doesn't have to be about elevating the single charismatic voice to be the voice of the people. It doesn't have to be about emulating or trying to mimic a particular type of quote unquote success. We can dream differently. I would much rather have a form of leadership that is shared, that is collective, that allows us to bring our full humanity and is invested in our wholeness, rather than what I see so often happening to my clergy colleagues, which is that they're just drained.
There has been this looming sense of grief and loss in the United States, and up until very recently, just absolutely ignored by those in the highest positions of power. And so, I wonder, how has COVID impacted the communities that you're working in? How do you see, is there going to be a lasting need for conversation and healing? And how do you think about that going forward?
Sure. We talk about our work, within our work, that healing is not a destination, but is a journey. It is a process that we are constantly evolving in. And I'm a big believer, having had, it feels like a lot of death loss in my life as a relatively young person. I lost one of my best friends in September, and he wasn't the first friend that I've lost. And what I've learned is that grief can be one of my greatest teachers, that actually grief is a pathway in many ways to deeper love and a reminder that we are alive and that we are not a culture that does memory well. And being married to someone who's Jewish and part of a tradition that very much holds memory as sacred, I believe that one of the characteristics of what I've been thinking about is radical hope. So a hope that is deeply rooted, for me, that's rooted in the wisdom and tradition of my lineage and ancestry and of just regular Black women. One of the lessons that those church mothers taught me is that memory can be an antidote to death, right? If we name it, if we acknowledge it, if we sit with it, and not just tarry in the pain of it, but through the lived experience of our pain. There's a scripture in Psalms that talks about, you've turned my mourning into dancing for me. That there is something about living out the practice of grief and memorializing collectively that begins to turn into a space of celebration and of life. In this case, I'm never going to celebrate the unnecessary deaths that have been a result of failed public policies and practices that just didn't have to be this way. And when I grieve, I feel a deepening commitment to the other members of my community. When I grieve, I feel a deepening sense of collective love and understanding and memory for those who've passed. And those are all resources for us, ritually and interpersonally, that I think at their best drive us to a deepening sense of collective imagination around what we can change so that this never has to happen in the same way again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think across the world, people have been having to make these adjustments, even as they've been living the tragedy of not being able to be physically in the presence of their loved ones as they've transitioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And given all of the changes recently, I wonder if you might just imagine with me for a moment what you would like to see happen. What do you hope in the sense of community, your faith, maybe just the future?
I've been a part of a series of conversations and roundtables lately with Black faith leaders in the U.S. from a variety of traditions and spiritual lineages, and those of no faith at all. And a conversation that has recently emerged, or that was emerged from that space, was a question, which is, could we imagine a collective identity around Blackness that was not rooted in our suffering, our violence, or our pain? And I take that question really seriously. I'm like, yeah, because that's not all I've known of my experience of Blackness. And yet, I think that, and I don't know that that is unique to the Black community, but I can only speak from my experience. I want a vision of Blackness that is rooted in wholeness and celebration and joy and resilience, and that honors our past and our future. And I have a mentor who says that loving Blackness is the spiritual mandate of our time, in part because if we get that part right, then loving everybody else becomes much easier, right? That is the hardest thing to do. And so I guess for me, invitation to dream. I'm always talking to people about imagination and dreaming. I want my baby, who's 6 months old, who is the child of a Black woman who was raised in the Midwest and who is a Christian preacher, and a white Jewish man who was raised in the South, who was born into a world in 2020 that continues to see a rise in anti-Black racism and anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism, to be able to live his life and to live his life knowing that he's loved, that he's able to just be and do and live and flourish in and with community, and that his value is not tied to what he's able to produce, but just because he is. That's the hope that I have, that he would be able to live in a community that is deeply intergenerational, and that the elders in that community are seen as valuable, and that their wisdom is seen as expert, even if they didn't get degrees from huge name institutions or have resumes that we would see, quote unquote, as impressive,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that his genius is recognized, and that genius does not necessarily have to be about, you know, what mathematical equation he can solve or how he assimilates into whiteness, right? He's real light skinned, and he's really light skinned. And for me, that's been like I've been reckoning with that as a Black mama and the fear that one day I'll be seen as his nanny and not his mom. But that, like, he just is, that we sit in the isness of it all and like love and support and like flourish together. That we figure out how to be together, like just be, not do, but be together in community. I want that.
Oh, that's nice. So I hear you saying that you want care and love and wholeness, and it seem like those should be the things that we focus on as ways, as you said, to thrive, to not just survive, but to create thriving communities.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so like, I'm not tired of talking about oppression because it's reality, but I'm tired of talking about oppression without following that up with it. And then what, right? Like, I'm tired of like getting caught into the arguments about systems and not getting to the place where we imagine something else. Because we need it. We need the reckoning. We need the uncovering. We need the apocalypse. And then what? And then we need to live, right? And so I'm curious about the conditions of flourishing that allow us to, and conditions of possibility that allow us to live like for real, for real.
I'm with you. I'm ready for that too. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jen. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for the questions.
That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. The Religion and Public Life program is on Twitter at RiceRPLP. Thank you again to our guest, Reverend Jennifer Bailey. Today's show was written by Haley Hemstreet, Rachel Schneider, and myself. Our producers are Three Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Pamela Prickett. Until next time.